to another edition of the Halloween playlist, as we continue in Halloween Horrors, edited by Alan Ryan. I am the Gruesome Ghoul. Today's nasty little feature will be a story called Eyes by Charles L. Grant.
Let us repeat. Trick or treat. We've walked and walked the livelong day. We've knocked on many doors. Behind each door another face, and now we've come to yours. Trick or treat, trick or treat. We're children who live just down the street. Give us something to spend or something to eat. Let us repeat. Trick or treat. The day is turning into night, and shadows now appear. What once we sang so loud and bold, we mumble now with fear. Trick or treat, trick or treat. We're children who live just down the street. Give us something to spend or something to eat. Let us repeat. Trick or treat.
Introduction. Eyes by Charles L. Grant. Charles L. Grant is one of the best-known American writers and anthologists in the field of horror. His novels include the Ox Run Station series, The Nestling, Night Songs, and The Tea Party. But he is best known for his hauntingly dark short stories collected in Tales from the Nightside, A Glow of Unicorns, and Nightmare Seasons. Grant is a proponent of what he calls quiet horror, subtle dark with a lingering bitter aftertaste. For this book, I urged him to write something nasty, something really nasty. The result is Eyes. Eyes by Charles L. Grant. The leaves were gone when the wind returned past sunset, and there was nothing left to do but help the empty branches claw at the sky. An unlatched gate fought its brown rusted hinges. An empty silver trash can toppled off the curb, its lid a clattering pinwheel until it struck the rear bumper of a small truck at the corner. A shutter banged open, slammed shut, and froze. Curtains trembled. Shadows walked. Street lamps grew brittle, hazed white light without a promise of warmth. The only traffic signal in town swayed like a hanged man, tugging at its gray wires until it flared just red. And the leaves on the ground, here raked into piles and there untouched and turning brown, hunched and spun madly into man-high dervishes that slammed against hedges, exploded against porches, crested off sidewalks into the windshields of passing cars. They hissed and crackled, their edges age-sharp and stinging. And when they swept past lighted windows, they were hunting bats and raged. Ron turned his back against the leaf-woven wind and waited for the gust to pass him by. The collar of his black trench coat was snapped up and back and folded out in front, the gold-buckled belt cinched tight around his waist. All he needed, he thought, was the hat Bogart wore, and someone would surely ask him how to get to Casablanca. As it was, the length of his brown hair tangled around his ears, poked needles at his eyes, and there was no sense brushing it back because the wind was still there. He didn't mind it, standing out here in the cold and the dark. Made him feel as if he were stalking a killer or a spy or a warlock determined to conquer the world with mad spells. Certainly made for better copy than saying he was just waiting for his son. He grinned to himself. He walked a few paces to the corner and leaned back against the rear fender of a red pickup. In the gutter was the dented metal lid of a trash can, and he almost picked it up before he shrugged and changed his mind. A gust made him squint. A cat's scream made him jump. "Come on, Polly," he urged. "It's getting cold out here." The houses that surrounded him were well lighted and old, comforting in their size and the people who lived there. And it was curious, he thought, how tomorrow they would be transformed into birthplaces of goblins, of witches, of burnt cork hobos out foraging for a candy meal. Even now, as he looked around, he could see the holiday trimmings, stalks of maize taped into the storm doors, cardboard cutouts of ghosts on the windows, a basket of polished apples, black cats hissing, and the eyes. As he pushed away from the truck and paced up the street, he could see the eyes watching. Orange eyes, flickering eyes, winking in the wind. Jack-o'-lanterns balanced on porch railings and perched on front stoops, hiding from the cold in the split of a curtain, staring out from a child's bedroom on the second floor behind the trees. He didn't mind the black cats and the hags and the monsters. He didn't mind the trick-or-treating or the UNICEF brigades. And he didn't even mind the cold, jagged grins the pumpkins gave him as he passed. Knowing grins. Dead grins. He didn't mind them much at all. The eyes, on the other hand, gave him the creeps. They were up there, looking out, looking down, and they saw him. Polly knew. 2 years ago, Ron was holding his son's hand as they walked through an Indian summer night to fill the paper bag with candy. They passed several of the boys' schoolmates, all of them greeting him with muffled laughter, with jeers behind his back. Polly didn't care as long as his father held his hand, and Ron didn't care as long as Polly knew that some people were cruel when faced with something different, something they were too young or too secure or too stupid to understand. It happened every year. Each Halloween since Polly had been old enough to get into his costume and walk with him door to door. But 5 years ago, when Polly was nearing 10, a group of teenagers laughing their way from one house to another began following them, making rude comments until Ron could take no more. He turned and faced them, his hands in fists, out where the kids could see them. "Oh, very brave," he'd said, and the laughter faded as the teenagers huddled. One girl carefully studying the sky. "Very brave." "Oh, come on, Mr. Ritter. We're only kidding." "No," he said. "Don't tell me. Tell my son." Polly had tugged at his hand, wanting to leave, clearly afraid. "No, you tell my son you think he's funny. Go ahead. Tell him to his face." They muttered, shuffled feet, finally turned and walked away. None of them looked back, and Ron filled his lungs with the warm night air. "Daddy?" "It's okay, pal. It's okay." At the corner, a boy suddenly whipped around and lifted his middle finger, and Ron reacted before his mind caught up. He broke into a sprint, dropping the paper bag on the sidewalk as the sprint became a charge. The boy gaped and turned too late. Ron grabbed his shoulders and shoved him hard into a hedge, grabbed his denim jacket in one hand, pulled him close and smiled. The eyes widened in fear. Ron slammed a fist into his stomach and shoved him back again. When the boy doubled over, Ron put a knee to his chin and stepped back to avoid the blood from the split lip and the slashed gums. Then he glared at the rest of them, some ready to run, two ready to fight. "Go ahead," he invited, still smiling. "Go ahead. When you're done with me, maybe you can beat up on the retard." One of them, a girl, caught a gasp behind a palm. "Hey," Ron said. "That's what you're thinking, right? This kid's a retard. He looks funny, walks funny, maybe dribbles a little when he tries to talk. A clown, right? No problem. He can't hurt you." "Mister, that's not fair." He nodded. "You're right, little girl. It isn't fair at all, but you don't have the slightest idea what I'm talking about. Not the slightest idea." Then he spun around and hooked the fallen boy by the collar, yanked him to his feet, and virtually thrown him at his friends. "Clean him up," he ordered in disgust. "He's a disgrace to this town." As he returned to his son, poor Polly, standing all alone in the middle of the sidewalk, holding the paper bag his father had dropped, his Batman's cape limp, his store-bought costume not quite fitting, Ron began to cry. He was glad he'd hit the kid. For years he'd wanted to do something like that, and every time the urge took shape, every convention in the book had stopped him, had held him. He'd long since stopped telling Irma because she thought it was childish. Maybe it was, but it sure felt great. In the morning, he'd probably get a call from the police, and his wife would shake her head sadly and wonder why he didn't stop and think. But he felt good, and there was no way at all he could explain that to Polly. "Wrong, Daddy," the boy had said then, surprising Ron to a halt. He looked down at the blue eyes, innocent, almost blank, and he could see the disappointment. "Wrong, Daddy, wrong." Over and over for the rest of the night until he finally lost his temper and dragged the boy home, refusing him any of his candy until the next day. But it was less at his son than at himself that his anger had flared. By hitting that punk, he had contradicted everything he tried to teach Polly from the time he could understand. The following year, he bought the pumpkin. A dog chained in a backyard began howling and barking. Leaves caught in a storm drain stirred and rustled under the wind. A large dead beetle lay in the middle of the sidewalk, and his heel crunched the hard shell before he could avoid it. The temperature dropped, and as his breath began to fog, the gutters were black with shadows. A woman laughed. The stars waited. The slow-dying grass began to gray with early frost. And the eyes. The houses went dark, but the candles were still burning, and the eyes brightened and dimmed and watched him pass through the black, dressed in black, avoiding their looks from over there on the rocker and over there on the mat and over there on the brick house at the corner where they gathered on the roof like the angry souls of waiting cats. He shuddered and watched his feet stepping over the cracks and around shadow puddles that weren't puddles at all. An empty pack of cigarettes was kicked to one side. A bottle cap, squashed flat, looked too much like a penny. He adjusted his collar more snugly around his neck and slipped his hands into his pockets, pursing his lips to try a silent whistle, failing and grinning self-consciously as if someone had seen him. The street rose slightly, and the houses began to drift apart, longer stretches between yards, higher screens of dark shrubs. By the time he reached the top, he was beginning to breathe heavily, and he scolded himself for smoking too much when he knew what was coming, when he knew he'd need the wind. Another grin, this one mocking. Wind, stamina, strong legs. Who cares? Polly wouldn't care. The trouble had been the pumpkin. He'd come home that year with the great thing in his arms, his cheeks puffed with exertion as he staggered into the kitchen and thumped it on the table. Irma was settled in the front room, knitting, scowling, telling him with her eyes that the boy didn't know what was going on, and she thought he was being silly, perhaps even cruel. But Polly had danced a clumsy shuffle on the tiled floor that made Ron smile a little sadly. Then he spread out the newspapers, brought out the knife and ladle, and with a running commentary spiked with bad jokes, he hollowed out the pumpkin. He tried not to seem nervous, but this was the first time he'd ever done it, and he wanted Polly to believe his father knew it all. Polly sat in his chair, chin in his hands, eyes on the knife, and the ladle and the seeds on the paper. A faint line of saliva glinted on his chin. He was pale. With a felt-tip pen, Ron drew the gap-toothed mouth, the triangle nose, and with his tongue between his lips tried to make the eyes straight. He knew they had to be triangular as well, but somehow they wouldn't work. And when he felt his patience going, he shrugged to Polly and decided to start in by carving the mouth first. Polly wanted to help. Ron denied him, gently. Polly pointed and frowned, shaking the table to unsteady his hand. At the nose, the knife slipped and cut Ron slightly on the thumb. Polly's eyes widened in fascination and fright, but his father didn't yell, didn't shout. He gnawed his lower lip and took up the knife again. A smile to show that everything was fine. Don't worry, I'll live. And he carved the first eye, slowly, grunting to himself, finally shoving the thick piece free into the pumpkin. A grin of satisfaction, and the second one was done. Try, Daddy? He shook his head. Son, you know better. This knife is too sharp. Besides, I'm already finished. Try. Polly, no. A pumpkin's like a person. It only has two eyes. Polly scowled, then lunged across the table to snatch the knife away and began stabbing at the pumpkin's finished face. Ron grabbed his wrist and squeezed until the boy whimpered, squeezed until the knife clattered to the floor. The pumpkin fell from the table, hit its side, and shattered. Try, Polly sobbed, wiping his face with the back of his hands. 2 eyes, you stupid brat. You only get 2 eyes. Wrong, Daddy. He felt like crying himself suddenly. Threw his arms around the boy and hugged him, rocked him, told him he was sorry, that there were things going on in the house and at work that he'd never understand. He didn't mean to take it out on the one person who couldn't fight back. Wrong, Daddy, wrong. Then Polly had plunged his hands into the wreckage and pulled out the triangle wedges poked from the eyes. He stood and held him to his face, grinned, and marched away. Ron lunged for him and succeeded only in giving him a slight shove through the doorway. Blinded by the pumpkin shards, Polly tripped over the loose edge of the rug and struck his head on the dining room table. There wasn't much blood. There didn't have to be blood. The corner had gone straight into his eye. Just beyond the top of the street rise, the church reached out of the dark ground, a black silhouette cut from the sky in spite of the moon. It was small, steepled, set back from the sidewalk behind a low picket fence. There was no parking lot. Parishioners used the streets and walked up the flagstone path to the dark oak double doors. On either side, maple and elm loomed as high as the belfry. In the back was the graveyard. Ron stopped at the far corner of the fence and looked around, checking for cars, checking for snoops. All he saw, however, at the bottom of the rise were the yellow flecks blinking furiously as the wind moved the branches, the yellow eyes watching him, though they faced the other way. He was alone. He stared past the church to the fieldstone wall, the chained iron gate, the headstones and mausoleums and spread-winged angels that marked the homes of the dead. He couldn't see Polly's grave from here, but that didn't matter. He visited once a month, could find a blind if he had to, and he apologized to his son for not giving him longer life, for not having the money for the doctors who might have saved him. The blunt wedge of pumpkin had been driven almost to his brain. Well, tomorrow's the big day, he said heartily, silently, rolling his shoulders to drive off the cold. He hoped that Polly couldn't sense his resignation. What would you like to be this year, son? Space things are pretty big. Robots, spaceman, stuff like that. Orange eyes. No clouds this year, just lots and lots of stars. I don't think it'll rain like it did last time. Of course, the leaves have all fallen, but can't have everything, right, Polly? Right? Orange eyes in the graveyard. Maybe good old Batman again. What do you say? I still have all the things in your bedroom. I could iron the cape a little, wash the rest of it, throw it in the dryer before I go to bed. Since you'd have to wear a sweater, it's so cold you look like you have more muscles than anyone in town. Orange eyes moving. Will you let me know, okay, son? Let me know. I'll be waiting. His cheeks puffed, and he blew wide into the black, sniffed once, and turned back down the hill. The town below was silent. The wind had died. The moon was gone behind a cloud that drove back the stars. His heels were low now on the pavement, and the brush of his trench coat against his legs annoyed him. He was cold. He'd done his duty, and he was cold. He'd gone to his son as he promised he would when the boy lay dying in his arms, and he told him what it would be like on Halloween this year. 4 years in a row, and he wondered how long he'd have to keep this up before the nightmares left him. Polly, writhing and screaming on the dining room floor, his hands clamped against his eye, and the slow, red trickle of blood between his fingers. Polly gulping for air as the ambulance took him. Polly trying to speak as he was wheeled into surgery. Polly dying. Polly dead. Irma had left him 2 weeks later, sobbing that she wanted no part of a man who killed his children. He reached the first house and paused to wipe a hand across his brow. He closed his eyes for a moment, then looked back over his shoulder. Orange eyes moving. There was a pumpkin in the middle of the sidewalk. There was a pumpkin squatting in the middle of the road. All right, Polly, he thought, stop fooling around. He moved more quickly, the incline giving him speed and making him colder as the night parted and let him through, let him pass by the eyes on the windows, on the porches, on the roofs, by the eyes glittering and flickering and winking on the lawns and in the street and on the pavement behind him. No shadows at all. I didn't mean it, Polly, he thought. I was just kidding. His house had no porch, only a concrete stoop. The pumpkin he kept there never had a candle, never had a flashlight. The way kids were these days, he knew he'd be lucky if it lasted through the holiday before somebody smashed it. He opened the door and looked behind him, and the eyes in the yard. Polly! He closed the door and leaned against it, unbuckling the belt and pulling off his coat. It fell, and he didn't touch it. He stumbled wearily down the hall and into the kitchen, sat at the table and stared at the kettle on the stove. A pumpkin seed lay on the floor by his shoe. He nudged it aside, then cracked his knuckles, rubbed his face, and took a deep breath until he thought he was calm. Then he focused on the newspaper spread open before him and suddenly decided he'd go to a movie. He smiled. A movie? It had been months since he'd been in an honest-to-goodness theater, had popcorn and soda, stayed for the second show. Years since he'd done anything he hadn't done with Polly. It might be a good thing. It would be a great thing, of course. He could still visit the grave and still go through the ritual, but there's no sense sacrificing the rest of his life by living in the past. No sense at all. So a movie it would be. He reached for the paper, soggy and stained orange, and turned the pages gingerly until he found what he wanted. His finger slipped down the column to check the times and the titles, his lips moving as he read, and the lights went out. The kitchen was dark, except for the eyes. The eyes in the window, and the eyes in the front room, the eyes on the staircase, and the eyes on the stove, and the eyes in the shadow that came through the back door, triangular eyes, orange and flickering. The paper turned to ash and flaked to the table without a spark, without a sound. Polly, wrong, Daddy, wrong. Polly, for goodness sake, do it, Daddy. Eyes on the ceiling, eyes on the table. He thought about telling Polly just to go to hell. Sighed and rose stiffly, still cold and tired. He walked to the doorway and looked back with a sigh. Polly, I'm getting awfully sick of doing this every year. Daddy, try. I said I was sorry. Every Halloween the same thing. Every Halloween the screaming and the bleeding and the agony until dawn. Every year the day in bed until it was over and he had 11 months left to get himself ready again. Every year, 11 months to think about running and knowing he couldn't because Polly wouldn't let him. Daddy? Polly, he said, suddenly licking his lips. Polly, you are going to help me, right? I mean, you're not... Try, Daddy, try. He took a deep breath and threw himself at the table, turning his head to catch the corner just right. Eyes.
Trick or treat, trick or treat. When you hear the doorbell ring, ding, 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 ding. Trick or treat, trick or treat. Lots of candy, gee, it's dandy. Trick or treat. Painting up your cheeks and nose, dressing up in funny clothes. Lots of candy, gee, it's dandy. Trick or treat. Dum, 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 dum. Cinderella, Peter Pan, walking with a monster man. Dum, 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 dum. Lots of candy, gee, it's dandy. Trick or treat. La, 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 la. Goblins, witches, all about. Get you if you don't watch out. La, 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 la. Lots of candy, gee, it's dandy. Trick or treat.